Hello and welcome back to the Analytics FC podcast. I'm your host Chris, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Beal. So Ryan has a degree in computer science and also a PhD in artificial intelligence, and at the moment he is the CEO and co-founder of AI company Sentient Sports. So in this conversation we start with somewhat of a broader overview of what AI actually is, and then specifically how it can be applied to the world of football. So we talk a little bit about signing players, we talk about scouting, and we talk about decision making and how AI fits into all of those different things. We then went on to talk a little bit more about what Ryan and his team have been doing at Sentient Sports, and one of the things that really caught my attention there was GuardianAI. So it's a really cool piece of technology that is able to detect online abuse directed at players, officials and different athletes in real time. Hopefully you will find this conversation as interesting as I did, and you may also learn a thing or two along the way regarding AI, LLMs and computer vision, and how all of those things are currently and will continue to impact the sport we love. So without further ado, let's bring Ryan into the conversation. Ryan, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Hi Chris, yeah, not bad, thanks. Yourself?
Yes, very good. Thank you. Very interested. I'm very interested to speak to you. AI is obviously a kind of hot topic at the moment, but I think, there's a lot of people, me included, that don't fully understand it, don't know what the applications are, and especially related to sport. We're all involved in sport here. All the viewers and listeners are interested to see how AI can potentially integrate into, their football clubs and things like that. So hopefully you'll be able to answer some questions today, Ryan. So, what I'm hoping to do in this kind of episode is we'll kind of start with some generalized questions just to set the scene so people can start to understand the basics, and then we'll get into how the AI and different things, how that can be applied to sports, specifically football. We're going to speak about scouting and recruitment as we usually do on this podcast, but then there's other applications that we're going to speak about in terms of things that you're working on currently with Sentient Sports as well. So I'm looking forward to getting into that, Ryan. So what I like to do first off is pass it straight over to the guests. So I'm going to give it over to you, Ryan, just to give yourself a quick intro, who you are, what you're currently doing, just to set the scene a little bit.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm Ryan Beal, CEO and co-founder of Sentient Sports. So my background is in AI research. So completed my PhD at the University of Southampton back in 2021. Since then, AI has changed massively. So happy to sort of dive into some questions and then go through that. But we've worked with teams and sports organizations across different areas of AI. So recruitment and scouting has been one area of that, fan engagement and some of the newer stuff we're doing on social media protection now. So we've seen it from different stakeholders across the game, and it's been really exciting to see it evolve. The challenges have definitely changed since ChatGPT was released back in 2022, and the landscape seems to be evolving every single month. It's a really interesting field.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you said you've kind of Southampton University. Before we started recording, you mentioned you are a Southampton fan. So again, commiserations on this season for that, Ryan. It's not been the greatest one, but we won't pause on that too much. So, so in terms of, you come from that computer science background, PhD in artificial intelligence. So you obviously dedicated a lot of time so far in your early career towards this. So. What I wanted to ask you first off then is, can you just simplify what is AI in terms of, because more specifically kind of how it's used, but then also people that are listening may have heard terms such as like LLM, large language model, like what are that? Well, I want to try and understand what they actually are and what purpose they serve really.
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence has been a sort of umbrella term for a long time now, and that sort of encapsulates things like machine learning. It's looking at neural networks, agental AI, and obviously more recently large language models as well fall underneath that. I think from a higher level, it's any time where a computer system is trying to learn, evolve, decision make on its own effectively, and then how they can work together to sort of solve certain problems. And anything that feeds into that is part of that overall system. So like you say, I think large language models are definitely what has grabbed everyone's attention recently, but these are effectively really fancy predictive text models. I think they're trained with billions, if not trillions, of data points that are able to look at text, look at images and the sort of underlying data that's underneath images to then make predictions. And they're very good at this based on the billions of dollars that are thrown at them to be able to train them and build these really fancy transformer models that can do that. So that's really what's brought AI to everyone's attention. But I'd say the technology that underpins them, the advancement wasn't so much there as it was in the money that was thrown at training them. And I think that's what's really changed in recent years and what OpenAI have really done and sort of brought that into the forefront of everyone's attention. You can see Nvidia is probably a good example. They're not an AI company, they're a hardware company, but they're the ones who have probably benefited most from the AI boom, just on the back of the fact that their technology powers the training of these models. So yeah, you've got a really interesting field, but I think machine learning was sort of some of the underpinning of this going back a few years. That was on everyone's mind, because that gives you that forward-looking predictive analytics, where I think a lot of that is more applied to sport, and a lot of what we've done is in that area, underpinning some of the models. So yeah, we can dive more into large language models and sort of how I see them being used in sport, but hopefully that's a good overview.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned predictive analysis. We're going to definitely come on to that as well. You said ChatGPT, which I think to a lot of people is like the extent of what people know about AI, and kind of people are using that day to day and stuff like that. So, in terms of, so would that be, is that an LLM? Is that kind of what? So that is what that is. Okay, perfect. So, so in terms of then LLMs or other applications of AI, so we've said it's used in scouting and recruitment. It can be, which we are going to delve into a little bit deeper. But just as an overview, first off, Ryan, what other areas within sport can AI be used? Basically, what other applications can there be?
Yeah, so I think the obvious ones in performance we'll come on to, but I think beyond that, fan engagement is going to be huge for this space. I think sports, and in particular football in the UK, have almost been behind on. Some of them have only just released iPhone apps. So you start talking about the really advanced models that can be used in this space. I think it will start to come more to the forefront, especially with more American money coming into UK sport. We're going to really see a shift in that area, and sort of building, I think, global content. You've obviously got content teams that sit at clubs, but ultimately being able to use technology to then drive more personalized content, both in terms of the content itself, but also the language that sits there. So if you're a Man United fan sat in Indonesia, you can receive really specific content about your favorite players in your local language and dialect to sort of the level of football that you want to understand. And I think that ultra personalization layer is where this will go in on the fan engagement side of sport, as well as all the other optimizations that you can do sort of in the back end that everybody will see across their jobs. I think you could prep for this podcast effectively by asking ChatGPT about your next guest, and you would get really sort of interesting insights, or at least give you a starting point for your research. I think that will sort of bleed into other business areas of sports as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because I've had obviously previous conversations. I know there's different companies like in injury prevention, things like that, using AI to kind of do things like that. We've got, people know of kind of VAR and kind of semi-automated offsides and things like that, which is all kind of using the technology that you're speaking about there, Ryan. So, how fast? I mean, you've kind of been involved in this from kind of the 2020 or so, or around that. So, how fast is this moving? Because you mentioned like it feels like we've had more developments in the last year than we had like the previous 10 or whatever. So is it kind of really is exponentially? And so does that kind of excite you? Does it frighten you? Like how fast are we actually moving with this, Ryan?
I think the reason you're seeing more now is sports are sort of perfectly set up to iterate in this area, where a lot of what sports tech was focused on was data collection for a long time, from sort of Prozone through to Opta, Stats Perform Huddle, where all of these companies have been very focused on collecting data. And ultimately, that means we've got 20 years of football data, which has very clear results, very clear sort of positive, negatives that you can learn from, that then sort of underpins a lot of these AI models. So you talk about sort of refereeing and injury models. There's very clear sort of training data sets there, where has a player been injured? How bad was that injury? What was the data that led up to that injury? And then you can start to build on top of it. So it's almost been the perfect storm of sports being set up for that. And I will still see it today, where tracking data is now becoming more prevalent across all of these areas. But these are billions of data points across a season that clubs themselves are probably going to struggle to dive into from a data engineering perspective to be able to really extract sort of value from them. And that's not because there's not good people working at clubs. It's more because they're working week by week to deliver match insights. And then in the transfer window, they're focused on that. So you really, I think, in these companies like what we're doing and other data consultancies are doing, to really be able to help teams extract long-term value from that data, to be able to iterate more quickly and make sure they're using tools effectively. So yeah, it's definitely going to continue to evolve. And both from an AI, ChatGPT, OpenAI, DeepSeek level, that's moving at a monthly basis, if not weekly. And sport will be the same.
Yeah. And just in general of kind of the adoption of from clubs, Ryan, I mean, you mentioned it was all about kind of collecting data, and it seems strange even now to think back, clubs push back on the use of data and things like that back in the past. So this is like the next level up in terms of, relying on computers and kind of code and algorithms to make decisions. I know there's still a human input into that, but in terms of how are you seeing that clubs are being receptive to this? Are they being receptive? Is that changing over time? Because again, it comes down to also like having people in the club with the understanding to actually know what this is, to be able to, it's kind of your job and other consultancies to be able to show the benefit, but it can be hard to understand when it's something totally kind of out there, especially when it comes to AI. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think translation to the users of this is really important, and it's one of the areas that I'm sort of most interested in on the recruitment side, is how can you take data and some very sort of black and white outputs and then translate that into footballing language so it can be trusted and sort of used properly by decision makers. And that is probably one of the key things that football still needs to work on. It's definitely moving in the right direction. There's really smart people using data in a whole different sort of ways now at clubs, but still I think there's movement there to be able to help them better understand the outputs. And one of the things we've worked on a lot is around explainable AI. So being able to not provide a black box model that says, like, sign this player because he's 80 out of 100, like you're on Football Manager. It's more trying to sign this player because he fits in with your teammates, because he's good at crossing, and this player that you've already got is good at heading. It's that trying to speak the footballing language that they already understand so that AI fits into workflows more effectively.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of gone back to, were you involved with AI Abacus in terms of, like, that was a company that was kind of around kind of scouting and kind of recruitment and stuff, which we are going to kind of get onto that kind of topic a little bit more, but just curious to ask a little bit around that. Is that still going? Were you involved in that, and to what extent?
Yeah, we were involved in that a few years ago, sort of licensing some of our AI to them when I was still doing my PhD, actually. Haven't worked with them for a few years now because we sort of work with the clubs directly since finishing that on a whole host of different problems. But yeah, it was interesting getting our first sort of access into clubs through them and being able to sort of getting feedback. And yeah, I think that trustworthy AI angle, as I was just talking about, it's probably one of the biggest learnings we had going from the lab and as a researcher to working with clubs. It was okay, you're sort of coming in and telling me AI says buy this player, but why? And at the time it was a black box model that couldn't answer that question, so you just get sort of brushed away quite quickly. Whereas now you can start to build sort of more open, under the hood models that aren't just sort of tell you a number and that's it, and you expect you to trust it. It's very much interpretable. You can ask it questions, those type of things to really build that trust. Yeah,
definitely interesting. So just going back to the speed of kind of evolvement, but also the change. So I'm just kind of relating this back to jobs. So for example, my background was I don't do it anymore, but was a video analyst. So it's one of them roles which has changed a hell of a lot over the last 10 years, and things like technology and things like AI is further changing that role. So I suppose that leads to kind of computer vision, which I suppose we can kind of explain what that is, Ryan, for the viewers, in terms of, if you can just want to give a simple explanation of that and how that works.
Yeah, so I'll preface by saying I'm not a computer vision expert. I think that field has evolved massively over the recent years as well. But ultimately, it's being able to collect data. In footballing terms, it's using tracking data, event data, but being able to sort of identify objects within a pitch. So that can be the pitch dimensions, it can be the players themselves, and then be able to extract data from that. So it's really using video to be able to extract different data sources. And you've seen that being used across all sorts of different applications now. And it's definitely helping collect data. I think Skill Corner are the prime example of this, where they're getting really good data out of broadcast footage now. And it just opens up a whole sort of footprint of coverage that can allow tracking data to be used in recruitment, whereas in the past it was more based on sort of optical tracking, which Second Spectrum can do for the Premier League, for example, which is brilliant data, but ultimately not scalable. So it's trying to find sort of ways of using computer vision to make data collection more scalable.
Yeah, because again, just going back to the video analyst example, was the role of that person was typically to watch games and just clip things out, which in time, which we're seeing now, but obviously it will become more prevalent, where that won't actually be a job role that the analyst will have to do. The computer would be able to pick out all of these things. Just kind of, is there any other specific kind of job roles then, whether it be kind of a scout or a director of football, which you see their job potentially changing with the integration of AI, Ryan?
I think everyone's job inside and out of football will change based on AI, but some of the more specific examples, like you say, in a video analyst role, it allows them to process more data. So if you've got 3 or 4 days between a game, you don't have that much time to watch lots of 90 minutes. You might be able to watch 5 or 6 games and then sort of use that. But now you can go back and sort of use the AI to analyze a couple of seasons worth of data of your opposition and then really focus in on what's important. So in that type of role, we see the video analyst becoming more of a translation layer to the coach, where the legwork, the sort of the boring clicking through and clipping, that's done for you, but ultimately allows humans to focus on what they're really good at, which is that interpretation and sort of helping take that data and then turn that into insights that can be effectively implemented in coaching strategy. And then that goes across recruitment, it goes across the business side as well, where ultimately for us, it's sort of, yes, how can they be the human in the loop in the system to say, well, AI can feed them analytics, but ultimately that decision-making layer is still taken by the leaders at the top. And that sort of efficiency side of it is really where we hold a lot of interest in.
Mm. And then just on kind of more on the scouts specifically, Ryan, because again, what some people think when they think of data, they think data is just pure numbers and stats and things like that. But obviously scouting reports and written reports from these people that are going out to games, that is obviously data as well. So I'm sure there's applications where AI can be used to basically help in the scouting process by reading reports and, you know, suggesting players, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I think it plays into every layer of that, of the scouting process, all the way through from sort of filtering down from thousands and thousands of players across the globe into that sort of long list, and then going from a long list into a short list. Our focus there has always been on that forward-looking analytics phase to say, well, okay, once you've got down to the short list, how can you start to extract new metrics that can help you do things that maybe scouts aren't so good at doing, or maybe sort of is different to the way that we've always thought about scouting. So really looking at, okay, does this player fit into the teammates that he's moving into? Because I think it's easy to an extent to find a good player who's scoring lots of goals at a certain league. What's not easy is saying, is he going to continue performing like that in our team? Will he perform well in our league? Will he perform well with our players, with our scouts, with our manager? That type of analytics is what predictive side of AI allows us to do, and something we focused a lot on. It's a tough one, or definitely was a tough one to sort of get buy-in on. And like I said, that trustworthy side of it has helped a lot. And we definitely see more buy-in now than we did back in 2020, first starting to have these conversations. But we definitely still see pushback as well. I think scouting is one of these sort of protected areas where it is a bit of an art form. And yeah, as a football fan, I still agree with that as well, where you can start to use subjective information that scouts do and people who are amazing at their jobs, combine that with data and AI to be able to sort of create a new efficient process that gets more value out of it and allows sort of better decisions to happen over time. And I think Brighton, Brentford, sort of these Bournemouth now sort of proving the cases with that, ultimately using data to make better signings, better manager decisions. And yeah, they're probably the best things to lean on in terms of saying that data is making a difference in sport.
Yeah. So when I was doing a little bit of research on you, Ryan, so I kind of understood you'd done a little bit of work initially on kind of fantasy football. Maybe that was the kind of the first step into kind of looking at scouting recruitment. Can you just talk a little about what that was, Ryan, and how that worked and what you were looking at there?
Yeah, it was more my co-founder Tim Matthews wrote a paper with our chairman Gopal Ramcharan back in 2012 actually, so it goes back a long time, and it was published at one of the biggest AI conferences of the world called Triple AI. I think that year it was in Canada. So sort of they went over there and presented this really cutting edge bit of AI research, and effectively it was using reinforcement learning, which is an area of AI allowing you to sort of almost train in a model based on sort of seeing what happens in the future and telling it sort of what was successful and what wasn't successful and those type of things. So it effectively did that by building these optimizers for FPL, and at the time it was getting into the top 1% of all human players. So it was really successful, and it basically was able to just almost simulate every single decision that could be taken in a given game week and then play that forward a number of different game weeks. So effectively looking at if you bring sort of Ollie Watkins into your team this week. What's he got coming up in the next 5 games? And always treating it like chess. And that's why you see sort of really good chess players come into FPL and then do well. So yeah, that was the catalyst for, I would say, my career in AI and sports. I saw what they'd done when I was doing my undergraduates. Sort of got in touch with a professor who's was my PhD supervisor and now is our chairman at Sentient. So that was definitely the catalyst for the company, and it shows how fantasy sports plays a really good sort of angle of getting more analytical people into the game and sort of looking at problems in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Are you still an FPL player, Ryan? Do you have a team this season, or?
Yeah, I am, but unfortunately, most of our team are better than me. I think I sort of blame time for it, but they're all quite good. One of the hires we made, actually, he finished 44th in the world, and that was on his CV when we hired him. So it definitely caught our attention, and was one of the reasons we definitely want to speak to him. And he's brilliant on the analytical side.
Yeah, he's probably got no Southampton players in there, Ryan, at the moment. So that's maybe why he's doing so good. So perfectly.
That was better last year when they were in the championship.
Yeah, definitely. So if we then move from kind of fantasy to real life, then, so just to again clarify and simplify for the listeners. So in terms of the data that the clubs have, so whether that be data from external companies or data that they are collecting in house, how do you go from that in terms of the data to then algorithms? Like what is an algorithm firstly, and kind of how does that process look in terms of then leading to making decisions further down the line?
Yeah, so the entire process, I guess a lot of the clubs now where they're given data from the league, they're buying their own data, collecting their own data, like you say, that's all is all deployed in a data warehouse or a database of some form. So when we're working with clubs, we'll go in and sort of pull down some of their data. We can then go through and, like you say, build out different models and different algorithms that can help interpret that data. And that could sort of range from like a player rating system or a team rating system, and sort of leaning on some of betting research from sort of the 1990s in that space, where some of the best papers can still help you extract value. And ultimately going through that and building different outputs. So our process for that is normally we'll work with a club to work out what they want to extract from that. So if it is a player ratings model, and then you start to identify features that will come into it. So if we want to look at how good a striker is, they might say, well, there are 5 things for a striker, is looking at goal scoring, recent and long term, heading, might be pressing off the ball, all of these different factors. We can then map that to the data to help us extract it, and then effectively build different process layers over the top of it to say, well, once we've identified how good it is, all these features, how do we combine them together about what's important? How do we learn from that data and evolve it over time? And then ultimately have outputs that are fed into the club for an iteration phase. Because ultimately we always want to involve them in the process as much as possible, get feedback and iterate the model both from a data perspective and a human perspective. Then going further down the line, it completely depends. Some of these models we've built are sort of pushed into automated reporting. So just sort of automate a PDF or a PowerPoint that can then be sort of passed around internally. I think more often now dashboards seem to be the best way forward. So the models we build, whether it's scouting or game analytics, are fed into dashboards, and then they can be shared amongst the data team at a club, the coaches, etc. So you're allowing a data team to sort of take full ownership of that. And then it's deployed, it's running over time. So every time new data comes into that database, it runs through the model, it updates the dashboard, and you've sort of got this really nice pipeline of information to update data.
Yeah. So just kind of on a number of algorithms, which I think you've worked on before, again, doing a little bit of research, Ryan. So in terms of, and it's all linked back to scouting and recruitment and bringing players in. So, excuse me. So like, firstly, a teamwork algorithm in terms of how players work together, whether that be pairings of players or groups of players, like that kind of chemistry. So can you expand on that a little bit and how that maybe looks at, and how it benefits signings basically?
Yeah, so this is one of the big areas of my PhD. I think first started working on this back in 2018, 2019, right at the start. And the data back then was event data. So what we did, we looked through the event data and started to build out sort of networks from this and parsing networks that you'll see. And then started to say, well, every model that we could see on the market at that time was focused on how are individuals performing in that. So we said, well, if we group them into pairs and bigger groups, can we work out what happens when they link up? So we analyzed every passage of play that involved a pair of players. and then effectively said, well, okay, when these two players link up, what happens? So do they move the ball further up the pitch? Do they lose possession? Do they create goal scoring opportunities, etc.? And then we built a reward system for that. So effectively, if they were moving the ball further up the pitch, if they're creating chances, they were rewarded for every passage of play. So we did that with every sort of real world event data from, I think, 2 Premier League seasons. Can't remember what the years were, but we extracted that out, and the numbers looked really good. Like it sort of fit intuitively who we thought the best pairs were. I think Kevin De Bruyne, unsurprisingly, was in a couple of them, but I think Granit Xhaka when he was at Arsenal, and it's sort of before he really had his sort of resurgence there, we were seeing that he was actually creating lots of other positive pairs in the Arsenal team at the time. And then we built forward-looking analytics on that. So we said, okay, if we can identify really strong pairs in a team that currently play together, can we then predict whether or not new players that are coming into a team will play together? So if you simulated a new signing into a squad, you can go through, create all of those pairs and predict forward what weeks or how we expect them to work together in the future. So we would do that based on all types of features from language, age of the player, how many appearances they've played in the past. If you're signing a player who played, I don't know, at a national team level, or they've played at a previous club together, how does all of that information feed into like creating a positive chemistry pair in the future? And we got some really cool outputs. I think it's a really interesting model. It correlates to transfer success, which we'll come on to because it's a really hard thing to define. But ultimately that sort of gave us something new in the market when we were first taking tech to teams. But it was definitely where we found out that interpretation of the model is really important. So it's like, okay, you're telling me this new sign is going to link well with this player, then it's why. So we had to unpick some of these models to say, actually, the thing that's really important is like, is it the number of games they play together, or is it these like more inherent traits of Kevin De Bruyne is an incredible passer? So what types of player does he link up well with? And it's often players that get him behind, the ones he can find, the ones who create space for themselves. Same looking at sort of James Ward-Prowse when he's at Southampton. Who should they sign to sort of get the best out of James Ward-Prowse's crossing and set pieces ability? And you can start to look at those type of things and answer questions in a slightly different way, which is really cool.
Yeah, definitely. Linked very much so to that is kind of the playing style. So if a player was to come in, do they fit in with the current playing style? And, you know, if I was and we've seen this in the past in terms of players themselves looking for transfers that suit their playing style. So, you know, I could be a player that would fit much better in the Belgian Premier League than I do in the Spanish second or whatever. So do you know what I mean in terms of that playing style and understanding my style and my attributes and how I can then basically get the most from them, really. So and I suppose the other thing around transfers and signings is kind of obviously the cost. It's a big money business buying these players. So I'm sure the data and the AI has a role to play in the fact of kind of cost benefit, like cost analysis and things like that, and working out whether the price is right, or, you know, if it's worth doing a transfer. I don't know if you can talk a little bit more around the kind of cost benefit on the side of things, Ryan.
Yeah, this sort of comes back to sort of classic Moneyball in baseball, where effectively it's trying to find undervalued statistics that could then lead to signing players for, at the time, cheaper wages in baseball, which in a sport that's sort of very much batting and bowling style sports, it's a little bit easier with the stats that come out of that. In football, it's a little bit harder to find that one undervalued stat that can help identify cheaper players. So ultimately, there's a whole host of things that play into this. And I think the unique thing about football compared to other sports is that future sort of rise of an asset value and treating a player as an asset, which a lot of the sort of better run clubs do now. And they're ultimately willing to say, well, if a player has been signed for 5 million and sold for 100 million, then that's a success, even if they're losing one of their better players. So I think Caicedo is probably the best example of that at Brighton, where that's got to be one of the most successful transfers of all time, because they're willing to sort of take the risk on a player who came out really well in the data, give him a chance in the Premier League, and ultimately see him adapt to that style. So I think predicting asset value over time is a big part of this, and being able to say, well, let's treat football as a business. It's very unique in the fact that players are bought and sold in that way, where in American sports they're not. In other sports, it's not, sort of more of a draft system. So ultimately, that is where I think a lot of work can still be done. We've looked at it a lot, but it's really challenging to predict how an 18-year-old is going to evolve over time and how that then correlates to market value.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll touch upon now the successful transfer. You mentioned it a second ago, Ryan. So in terms of because this is a very difficult thing. It's not as simple as, that was a good transfer, that was a bad transfer. There's obviously lots of things that go into that, and each club will probably define it in a different way. So, whether it is how many appearances they made, whether they've made the club a profit, whether they were brought in as a backup player, or things like that. So how do you think about that, and how do you then work with the clubs, I suppose, to ensure that you are correctly categorising a transfer, whether it be successful or unsuccessful?
Yeah, it's such a hard challenge, and ultimately you need to work directly with the club for this because they know what the purpose of signing that player is, and then you can build a custom metric for what is successful that signing. Because in one transfer window, you could end up signing a backup left back, a star striker, and a new goalkeeper, and all three of them obviously going to have very different success metrics. And ultimately, when you're doing this from the outside, it's very hard to know what that was, just because if you sign that backup left back and the first team left back gets injured then and suddenly he's playing all season, it's like you weren't really looking at the fact that he could play 38 games, but suddenly he played 38 games. So it's so hard to do without knowing or being involved with the club directly. Even in being involved with the club directly, it's hard to then get somebody to actually write down what the point of that transfer is, because a lot of it is that gut intuition of why we need this player. So I think that type of transfer success probably comes from owner and sort of very much C-suite level, to be able to almost get them to buy into the technology at the front end. So every time they define the success of a transfer, they know that's improving their models and it feeds back in. I don't have many examples of clubs that are actually doing that. I'm sure Brighton are, for example. Ultimately every club is very different there. So it's a challenging one to sort of have a one size fits all model for that type of problem.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just as another example, you could have, signed a more experienced older player, and how do you actually measure the impact they have on the younger players in the squad, for example? That might be a huge benefit, but you can't really measure that really. So it's a difficult one. So what we'll jump to next, Ryan, is you mentioned it already in terms of predictive analysis and kind of looking forward. So can you just kind of break down a little bit more about what you mean here in terms of, some people hear that and think, okay, are you predicting the future? Like what you're kind of doing, and why is it important to do these simulations and be able to look forward rather than just looking back?
Yeah, so I think a lot of scouting now is just focused on taking all the players you can see, and data scouting in particular is about focusing in on a subset of players that look like they will perform well. So it's ultimately going to be players who are performing well at their current team in their current league. So when a player moves from one club to another, so many different variables change. Their languages change, their hometown changes. They might be moving away from their family. There's lots of subjective things changing, and then all of the sort of playing styles things. They're moving from the French leagues into the English leagues is a very different playing style switch. And in Holland, they get more time in the ball, and Germany, we were sort of really strong defenses coming out of them. It was really interesting to see how these leagues are so different. So when you're sort of moving a player from one league to another, I think being able to say, right, this player has scored 30 goals in the Bundesliga, translating that into how many goals did he score given the chances we create in our team, in our league, is that layer that I think is really important that not many people were doing at the time. There might be more examples of this now. So it's being able to predict some of these stats. And sometimes it's a bit sort of crass to say, well, okay, we can predict he'll score this many goals in the Premier League. But it's more about the confidence levels, I think, to say that this player is a 10 to 20 goal a year striker based on this. And then I've always said diving into the why of that. So is it because of his current goal scoring rate? Is it because of, it's more about the playing style, just to say, well, he plays against these type of defenders in the Premier League. They're slightly stronger or they're slightly more physical, whatever that looks like. Therefore, we'll think he'll score less. And I think Timo Werner is probably a good example of this, where I think when we first started looking at this and he moved to Chelsea, all the stats we had on him were amazing. Like, I think it was like, oh, this is an incredible signing. And obviously he never quite ended up being as good as everyone expected. And a lot of that was due to the physicality of just moving to the Premier League and playing against different types of teams in a slightly different way. And it just never quite fit into his mold of translating those goals from Leipzig into the Premier League. And ultimately, later at the time, might have even got that wrong as well, but trying to sort of dig into it a little bit deeper to answer those questions of, okay, we found a good player. Is he right for us? That's sort of the biggest question that I would ask at the sort of decision maker layer. at the clubs.
Yeah. So I suppose the kind of predictive analysis and looking forward is more so around assessing the likelihood of different outcomes rather than, like I said, predicting the future and things like that. So it's kind of understanding what might happen, what's the chances of those, and then making decisions based on the risk and things like that. So
Yeah.
in terms of then running simulation, I just want to give an idiot's definition to this, Ryan. And so you've got, let's say we've got all the data, we've got 10, 20 years worth of data. And when you say we're going to, run simulations for different outcomes, like what do you mean by that? Like, how are you doing that? And are you choosing different parameters and tweaking it each time? Like, just, again, a simple explanation of what that actually means, really.
Yeah, so many different models that play into it, but I guess to give an example, it's sort of like what if analysis on then league simulation and tying it to, it comes back to success. Maybe success is getting a few, like making a whole host of transfers, and then how that relates to on field success and the sort of the overall table that it leads to. So what we've done here is tried to tie it to a simulation of, if we sign these 5 players, how does that then change our likelihood of getting into the Champions League or sort of avoiding relegation, and sort of tying it to the real world. So we can do Monte Carlo simulations and a few other different simulation-based models, which effectively randomly sample across different sort of potential outcomes. So you can look at how strong those new signings have made us, and then look at what else has been happening in the league, and then simulate that forward to effectively simulate the league table hundreds of thousands of times, to then give these like confidence intervals to say, of those 100,000 times, maybe 90,000 of those times the team stayed up. And that's the thing they're looking for. So they're looking to say, well, with these new signings versus without these new signings, run the simulation and then compare the two. So you're really trying to tie it to key outcomes, points per game, all of these, like, I guess, key metrics you do at the end of the season, but trying to do that from the start of the season to build out these confident intervals of saying, well, if we do that, we improve our chances of staying in the league.
Yeah, interesting. So let's kind of move to playing styles and kind of formations, and also kind of set plays as well, Ryan. So the way I think about this is kind of how, in terms of like live and during the game, what I'm trying to say is, like, when I think of AI, you have different softwares that have like assistants. So would a coach potentially have like an AI assistant, whether that be now, whether that be in the future, so they can, look at a game live and kind of iterate in terms of how are the opposition playing? That means that we could maybe make this tweak, or, do you know what I'm trying to say in terms of that kind of assistant, kind of helper for a coach? I don't know if you think about that at all.
Yeah, I think LLMs allow us to move towards this, where I almost see a large language model as an interface to other analytics effectively. I think when you use ChatGPT, if you ask it a very specific football question, it won't be able to answer it. It's either out of date, or it's got to Google it or wherever. You can ask it sort of how many goals has this player scored, and it can answer it. But if you said, how long have this team spent in a high block, or how much do these teams press in the final third, it just won't have a clue. It might try and answer it, but it would probably be wrong. So what we've found with LLMs is the best way for them to have an impact in sport is be able to feed them with other models. So what you can do is build, it will get quite technical, but it's called a retrieval augmented generation, so a RAG model, which then allows you to feed in other models into an LLM. So when you ask it a question, if you said, how long have this team spent in a high block, it would then be able to trigger another model that can do the analytics. So you're effectively daisy chaining these things together. So a non-technical user could ask a question, and it could be live in a game, but it could be a sort of pre-match analytics phase where you're saying, okay, tell me about how this team plays. It triggers this model, and then it feeds that information back into natural language and then translates that into footballing terms. So you're almost using that text-based interface as a way of sort of triggering things, whereas in the past it's always been dashboards, it's always been APIs, it's always been Excel spreadsheets that people are doing these things on. Whereas actually now, if you could just ask a simple one, sort of, you've got, your coach has got a question about how these team plays, you just ask the question, and then within like a few seconds you've got an answer, and it's based on real live data which can be updated daily. So that type of interface for me is really interesting. We've played around with it a little bit. I think it's still a bit early for that type of tech to really provide value, and it almost needs a coach. I think we're a few years away from a coach on the sideline on their iPad during a live game asking these questions to an LLM and then feeding that to the manager who's making decisions. But I can see it going in that direction where, we already see more technology on the bench during games. I think it's not going to be too long before yeah, AI plays a more sort of larger impact on that. But yeah, maybe stadium Wi-Fi needs to get better before that, but that's a different area.
Yeah, definitely. Because again, just going back to like my time as a video analyst, it used to be, it got to a stage where the analyst would then eventually, which is again a long time ago, but eventually be kind of mic'd up to the bench and they're seeing this aerial view, so they're then making suggestions down to there. So yeah, it's just interesting to think, in years to come, like the coach might just have almost like an AI assistant coach, and he's just really on point and just picking up things that's kind of happening within the game.
Yeah, we saw it in cricket recently. I think it was maybe the most when England were doing well in the World Cup a few years ago. They had their data team they sort of had a number of signals printed on like a laminated piece of paper, and it would be a case of just holding up that signal to the captain on the pitch, and then the captain knew what those signals related to. So I think building out these processes of saying, well, data and all of this cool stuff going on in the background is one thing, but how do we actually use that on the pitch is another. And it felt like the England cricket team had found a way of doing that at the time where, yeah, they were relating signals to that. The opposition obviously have no idea what holding up a number on the bench means, but the captain does. They can then execute on that, and you can see the sort of what came to fruition on it in England doing well in that World Cup.
Yeah, definitely. And then I suppose another area on the similar thing is it's kind of set play. So like the role of the analyst, as mentioned, has changed, but now we're seeing more niche roles. So like the set piece analyst, set piece coach, etc. So set piece for me is because it's kind of a static, like a set. It is obviously not. There's less going on. I feel like that would be an area where it would be able to benefit. Like, I mean, in my head, again, I might be totally wrong here, Ryan, but in terms of would we be able to, we've got the video of thousands of corner kicks, for example. Could that be fed into a kind of a model to understand the best way to attack against a zonal in this position? Or do you know what I mean, in terms of understanding the best ways and just tactical kind of insights from the machine, just watching videos basically?
Yeah, I think one of the issues on video there is it's such a congested area. So you sort of see the overlapping of players, and suddenly it just becomes during a normal patch of play, all the 22 players are quite distinct. On a set piece, you've suddenly got 15 players around the goalkeeper, and it's quite hard to pick out who's who in that from a video perspective. So I think, yes, it will go towards that, but it will take a while to get there just because of some of these more sort of data-driven problems. We saw Google and Liverpool had to go at this, I think, recently, and they wrote a paper looking at set pieces. I don't know if Liverpool are actually using this in reality, but that's some of the sort of smartest minds in football and AI coming together with, I think like the head of Google DeepMind is involved in that, and that's like the guys who've built incredible networks for sort of protein folding, playing chess, playing Go, those type of things, then coming into football and trying to look at set pieces, like you say, as an sort of an individual problem. And there's some really interesting stuff that came out of it. But I think ultimately there's so much psychology around it. You've got to know if your players can actually execute it. How many times can you have the perfect set piece set up and then the player fails to beat the taker fails to beat the first man? So there's so many different things that play into that. I don't think everybody's got a James Ward-Prowse that can execute on everything every single time. But it's ultimately building things that work for you. And I've spoken to set piece coaches who are like the detail that they go into from that human aspect. Like, spoke to one until about midnight once who had a folder about this big on a sort of every set piece that an opposition has taken in that year and the best way to break down. And it's all come through him watching them, learning about it, knowing the players that he has on the training ground, and then ultimately being given time to work with the squad on those things. So you're effectively building just one person's job being an expert in set pieces in the league. Ultimately, it's a known problem. There's only 19 other teams that you need to learn about. So you can do that sort of week by week, and then ultimately, they need to be given time on the training ground to implement those things, both from attacking and defensive roles. So, the data side of that maybe will speed up the analytics, but ultimately it needs that human side of, you can be the best set piece coach in the world, but if the manager doesn't listen to you or doesn't care, then it doesn't matter. So it's got to build up those processes. Yeah,
definitely interesting. So let's get to Sentient Sports then, Ryan. So your business now. Before we kind of go on to, because I want to speak about GuardianAI, so we're going to speak about that. But in terms of, because all of this AI and kind of the technology that's around this is, it's can be quite expensive, I would presume, in terms of the compute power that's kind of related to it. So I want to ask you a little bit about, you're the founder of the company, a co-founder of the company. So in terms of like raising money for companies, again, just maybe going a little bit off tangent here, but I think you've raised money a little bit before for other companies. Just what's the process of that like? And can you just talk a bit about the pressures of that as well? Because obviously then the kind of go into a timescale, the money's going to run out eventually. So yeah, just a little bit around that, Ryan, if you can.
Yeah, it's definitely shaped up that my role. Obviously, doing a PhD was very analytical focused, a lot of the stuff we've spoken about now. And then as we've come onto the business side, it has been a lot more of the sort of building out a really strong team, both on the analytics side and on the board side, and then using that to go out and sort of sell our vision to investors. So sports tech investing has evolved massively. It's definitely a sort of hot area. I think it comes from the fact that so much money flows in at the top level of sport, and then obviously technology that can sort of help at that top level, it has value. So yeah, for us, it's been really sort of being very clear about we've got, I think, one of the best teams in AI in sports. So what problems can we solve? And it's almost like we've spoken about already, the world of AI has evolved so quickly that we've looked at a few different areas across recruitment, across fan engagement, across GuardianAI, which we'll come on to. So we've really focused in on having this really strong team that can solve lots of problems and then building products off the back of that. So yeah, we've gone out, we've raised money from a few different guys, and yeah, it's been great to get that backing from people that really believe in our vision, believe in our abilities, and then deliver on that vision and turn it into a really profitable and valuable business.
Yeah, because I mean, you're still relatively young, right? But you raised money quite soon out of university as well, which again is a big kind of task. Not many people do that. So yeah, I was just curious to ask a little bit around that. So in terms of GuardianAI, let's get to GuardianAI then. So can you explain a little bit about what that is, Ryan, firstly, and then we'll kind of go into the applications of that.
Yeah, so I think having spent this much time in sort of the last 5 or 6 years in AI and sport, we've seen so many different problems that come up. And one of the key ones that have come up on our board, and we've got Ed Woodward involved from his time at Man United, sort of sat and said to him, what are some of the biggest problems you've seen? And one of them is definitely seeing the abuse that young players are receiving and how that impacts them both on and off the pitch. So it's a problem that we see getting worse. I think X in particular are now terrible at this. Free speech seems to dominate rather than actual common sense around racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. So we were effectively looking at ways that we can use the advancements in AI technology supplemented with some of the other analytics we have. So sort of on-pitch context with off-pitch LLM models to say, well, if we can identify abuse in real time, what can we do to stop that? So we've effectively built a product that can now go out there. It can monitor across X, Instagram, TikTok, look at what's being said about your squad of players, and then ultimately provide downstream analytics to stop the abuse. So it allows you to play a care team, play a welfare team to see if a player's become high risk. So have they had some really bad sort of death threats, or have their family been in the press or whatever? It looks like that would then flag the system. Have they sort of a young player's sort of made their debut, performed really well, and they've got lots of positive stuff going on, but ultimately they've gone from 10 posts a week to 100,000 posts a week. What does that then mean for that player, and how the educational piece that goes alongside that? We can flag all of that to the club so they can be on top of it. And then on sort of the league side, and on sort of maybe sort of focused on the legal and PR and comms side of sport, we can launch countermeasures. So we can automatically report any abuse to the social media platforms, identifying what policies have been broken. We can help effectively spotlight the abuse or send legal takedown notices via DMs. And then one of the other things we've worked on is this sort of like network analysis and forensic data logging. So if there is a really bad case of death threats or racism, which we see a lot of, unfortunately, in the Premier League, we can then launch these forensic data logs to identify who the individual is. We can look at the probability of conviction and effectively expedite the entire legal process. So if it's the EFL or the Premier League or whoever who want to take this case to court, they can do that very quickly and effectively create more cases of that. And then if the club want to ban that person from the stadium or sort of take in real world action, it means there's consequences for online abuse, which has got a little bit out of hand and isn't seem to be fixed at the top end by the social media platforms themselves.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Twitter has definitely got a little bit bad at the moment. So I think there's no incentive for them to do it, really. I don't know what you think on that. But in terms of, you mentioned the clubs and stuff, Ryan. So would it be the clubs that would use the product and then they would if I was a player, my accounts would be in there and then it'd be monitoring the whole squad's accounts effectively?
Yeah, that's one use case. So our sort of main stakeholders that we see using the product are the clubs themselves, like you said, to protect the squad. You've got the leagues who then want to look at it from maybe more of a legal perspective, but see what's going on, see which events and which fixtures in games are causing more abuse. The agents themselves as well want to look after their clients, and then broadcasters see a lot of pundits are being abused as well, so they want to use it to protect anyone in the public eye. So it's anyone who's really got a duty of care of an athlete or somebody who's in the public eye that we want to work with to help effectively flag when there might be issues.
Okay, and what's the perception from? Are you finding that clubs actually care about this, Ryan, enough? Because again, it comes down to, I suppose, if you're benefiting that player and making them feel more comfortable and less scared of abuse or whatever, that would obviously then increase their mood to be a better player. So there's obviously a benefit there. So I can see that myself. But are clubs seeing that? And obviously that's your job to persuade them. But are they caring enough about the whole online abuse issue?
Yeah, so I think player care and player welfare staff are becoming really common now across Premier League clubs. I think pretty much every Premier League club's got a player welfare sort of head of player welfare member of staff that are doing really good things, but that role varies massively from being like a player's concierge of booking sort of phone contracts and then helping them get rent, which is serious things that need to be taken into account to help a player settle, all the way through to sort of helping them how they sleep and linking it to performance, etc. So for us, I think on the performance side, we're really keen to tie our data to how the players then react to being abused, because ultimately, and we're still in sort of development with some of this, but we assume that some players react differently to abuse than others, and especially when it's aimed at their family, we want to help the clubs then effectively get more out of their players and help protect them by saying, well, ultimately, if the player feels protected and feels like themselves or their family are going to be abused, that something will happen. It allows them to sort of play with a little bit more freedom there and sort of understand what the consequences are. So there's a little bit of tying it to performance, but I think to your original question, clubs really do care about this now. And they definitely want to get on top of it because ultimately it's not going to be solved by the social media platform. So they need to do something about it. And things like the Online Safety Act and things like Kick It Out and what they're doing, that all plays into, the problem's there. There's mechanisms now to identify the problem. What can the clubs do to actually action it and solve it and help their players, which is exactly the type of product we're trying to build.
Yeah. And then you mentioned kind of it is real time then, Ryan. So I'm presuming it's picking up the triggers that cause a spike in online hate and online abuse. So what is that like literally? So if I was to miss a penalty, you would then be able to see at that point I was getting a lot of abuse. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we sort of track toxicity throughout a game. So we've got like a match hub in our tool. Obviously, it runs 24/7, but most of the abuse happens during, let's say, an hour plus or minus around the game. So exactly that. You can see throughout a game when toxicity is growing. I think one of the coolest charts we've got here was during the Slovakia game during the Euros, where they're obviously 1-0 down and we're just about to go out of the Euros and luckily got 2 goals at the end. But the toxicity chart went sort of massively. The toxic messages that were coming through are horrendous. They scored the 2 goals and it just fell off a cliff. But ultimately, the tech can identify these flashpoints within a game, and some of them are performance driven. So it could be a player performing badly, missed a penalty, is being sent off. But some of them are more sort of subjective data that we can extract from the social media. So let's say if 2 players are sort of getting quite fiery at each other, that doesn't come across in event data. You can see there's lots of tackles between them, but if you're in the stadium, if you're watching on TV, you can really see if 2 players are sort of nibbling at each other. They're sort of trying to get a rise, and social media data picks up on that. And ultimately, players in those scenarios then are targeted by fans. So that type of both performance and objective data, tied with subjective data, allows us to identify those flashpoints.
Yeah. The England game you mentioned, I was at the game, Ryan, and there was also some toxicity in the stands as well. Yeah, it wasn't pleasant. But yeah, so in terms of, is there a worry then? So obviously you're using AI to detect this, but what about on the other side? Like, is AI being used? Because we've seen like, especially Twitter, like bots and things like that. So like, they're not even real people that are doing this abuse. So how do you think about that? And is that, you mentioned kind of automatic kind of reporting to the platforms and stuff like that. Where do like bots fit in, and also then fighting against AI on the other side, really?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a game of whack-a-mole at the moment. I think one bots is a big part of that. So you can then start to look at whether or not it's worth even pursuing a bot, and if you can throw away some of the data, depending on what level of abuse there is there. But identifying where troll bots are coming from is one thing. And then the other side of that is deep fakes. I think during the Euros, you saw a lot of Gareth Southgate being deep faked. It's very satirical, but I think there's a huge risk here for sports where things move from annoying sort of satirical content, but towards much more minor tweaks to press conferences, for example. Let's say if someone's edited a Gareth Southgate video to say that a player was injured for the Euros final, then you've suddenly got a slightly different angle of this. Well, that's affecting betting markets. It's being used in a slightly different, more malicious way to financially benefit or whatever that looks like, where actually that's harder to then extract, because ultimately, we can all work out when it's a deep fake that Gareth Southgate saying something stupid, swearing a lot. That's very easy to distinguish between what's real and what's fake. Where there's more danger is when there's those very subtle changes that can then affect things, or sort of he said something that he hasn't said. I think we see it a lot in politics, and especially over the last few years, we've seen that. So that area, I think, for sports is really a risk at this stage. And GuardianAI, what we're building, is going to have that deep fake angle in, so it can help identify deep fakes quicker than the social media platforms to say, Gareth Southgate wouldn't have said this because of X, Y, and Z. So you can really quickly shut those down and sort of be able to spotlight when a deep fake has happened, so people don't fall for it, and it can't have that malicious effect down the road.
Yeah, the deepfake stuff's like really is scary. I mean, especially to the older gen, like my parents or they don't know what wouldn't be real, so it's very hard to tell in some cases. So yeah, it's quite fascinating, really. So that's really interesting stuff about the GuardianAI, Ryan. I mean, what I would like to ask you then is, in terms of kind of looking ahead, we've touched upon some predictions and things like that, but I want to kind of put that to you, maybe hypothetically then. And this is probably a very hard question to answer, Ryan, but if you were to envisage what a top level football club might look like in, say, 25 years time, when AI is, what would you maybe foresee that they would be using, and how would they be applying AI when the technology has gone further?
I think to start with, we'll start seeing more AI specific roles at clubs at decision maker level. So I think like the notion of a CAIO doesn't exist yet in sports, but I think we'll see more of that role come in, where somebody will effectively work at that decision maker layer to implement AI across performance and the business side, and then ultimately it will propagate throughout all of that. Where I don't see it displacing roles as much. It's more about efficiency, and I think the best teams in the future will be the ones that use really good human teams linked with really good AI teams. That combination, and the ones that can get the most out of that combination, will be the best teams in the future. I think we're already seeing that at Brighton now. Like, there's a lot of around their data, but they've got brilliant people that use that data better than anyone else. And that sort of combo of the two is what the best teams of the future will be. And that goes in and outside of sports. So definitely seeing that being the direction it goes. And like I said, fan engagement is a big part of that. The investment that we see coming into sports, a lot of that comes from the fact that football in particular touches half of the world's population. There's sort of 4 billion people involved with loving football, according to FIFA stats anyway. And I think that the fact that it can touch that many people means there's a huge opportunity for, at the moment, they sort of, the top revenue is sort of around 800, 900 million euros a year. But these could be multi-billion-dollar businesses. They could be treated like social networks if you get the fan engagement side right. So I sort of see that being the way it goes as well. There's just so many people who love football that I think there's a huge opportunity there, that if the tech is right and if the ultra personalization and the language side of it is right, you can start to engage through technology way more people across the world. And that's sort of fan experiences in, I don't know if you've seen in the US now, they've sort of built virtual stadiums where you can go to a bar and sort of feel like you're sat in Old Trafford. I think if you could do that in some like Singapore, Hong Kong, some of these areas where you've got people who never go to Old Trafford but will pay big money to have this virtual corporate experience, all of these type of things are going to sort of take sports, I think, to a new level. And that's what underpins the investment that's coming in from some of the richest people in the world.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I've seen them. They look really cool, to be honest. I'd like to give them a try. So maybe not replacing jobs. Then you mentioned it'll make people more efficient, and they might bring on new jobs. But I'm just kind of thinking, what about kind of match officials then, Ryan? Have you ever thought about them in terms of, we've seen semi-automated offsides and stuff? And to me, again, I'm not an official, so I might be totally wrong here, but I feel like the job of a linesman, for example, could be something that probably we won't need moving forward. Like that could just be a camera and just going, I don't know, and maybe obviously a referee's a lot more harder, like detecting fouls and things like that. But yeah, I don't know if you've got anything on that, Ryan.
It's not something we've looked at massively, but I think the missing link for VAR and for all of this technology is how does the human side connect to it? I think sports is ultimately entertainment, and I think VAR has sort of caused more frustration, and it's sort of getting more decisions right, but ultimately it causes even more frustration, and referees have less to hide behind. Yeah. It's almost like, how can you help referees make better decisions? I think that's the almost that psychology angle has been missed around, one, keeping fans happy, but two, allowing the referees to sort of communicate effectively to make better decisions, and ultimately having a peer sat in Stockley Park then trying to tell their colleague they've made a mistake in front of millions of people. Like, just from a human side, that's not a tech problem. I think the tech is great. You can suddenly dive in and see a lot more. The tech isn't the issue here. The issue is how the humans use the tech. And it's not the referee's fault. They clearly haven't had enough training, or not enough thought has been given to that link to say, well, actually, what do they need to get the most out of this? And maybe put it on a decision maker clock to say, well, actually, if you've got the technology and you want to make a decision, you should be able to do that in 30 seconds. And if you can't, it just reverts to on-field decision. I think there's more on the human side that needs to be, human process side that needs to be done there to just, one, help the fans enjoy, especially in a stadium. Like, I've got a season ticket, I'm at most games, I see it a lot in the stadium, and it's just dull sometimes when you sat there waiting, you don't have any updates. So I'm keen to see it move and help improve the TV and in-stadium experience for fans, while, again, helping the referees, because ultimately, we come back to the GuardianAI side, they get some of the worst abuse you'll see. So ultimately, maybe not getting rid of the lines, because I think having a team of officials is still a good thing, but the team making group decisions using technology is probably where it needs to go.
Yeah, definitely. Because they're kind of doing where they speak to the stadium now, the referees. I know they did it in rugby anyway, but I didn't even notice that they'd added that into football. So I'm sure, who'd be a referee, Ryan? I'm sure they get, they get so much abuse. It's not.
I have a lot of respect for them making those decisions under that pressure. And obviously, as a fan, you're sometimes frustrated when they get it wrong. But ultimately, someone's got to referee games. I think, especially at Sunday League level, you see go down the local park and the guys who are doing it in front of the man and their dog and getting just as much abuse. It's a thankless task, really.
Definitely. So what I wanted to ask, Ryan, is where can kind of people go if they want to learn a little bit more about AI? Maybe, so there's lots of kind of maybe data analysts that listen to this, and people that already have that kind of data mindset. But do you have any maybe go-to resources, just advice on kind of where to go to learn a little bit more, really?
There's some great football resources out there. So Friends of Tracking on YouTube, they did a lot during COVID and created really good sort of videos. I think Laurie Shaw from Man City now, he had a great one from when he was at Harvard, going into tracking data and pitch control models, which is brilliant. I would say, looking sort of into more deeper AI, there's free courses sort of all over the place now, but one of the best one is run by Stanford on Coursera. That's worth digging into as well. It gives a sort of good overlying or sort of overarching view on what the core models are in AI. And I think the combo of those football courses with like a deeper AI course then helps sort of stimulate the mind into how these things can be linked together and create new things. And really, it's just, I think what's great about football data, there's more available now to jumping on, trying new things, and if it works, getting it out there and having conversations about it.
Awesome, nice one. Well, listen, Ryan, I really appreciate your time. That was very, very insightful. Learned a lot, and I hope the viewers have enjoyed that. So, is there anything else you want to kind of give a shout out to at all? Anything you want to say before we wrap it up?
No, if anyone wants to use the GuardianAI technology, we're sort of onboarding free trials ahead of next season. So if there are any teams listening who would like to try out the tech, then reach out and I can get them onboarded, and they can see how that can sort of help their squad.
Amazing, perfect. Thanks very much, Ryan. Thanks for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day. So that's been the Analytics FC podcast. So thanks again for joining us. So if you have enjoyed this episode, please do like, follow, subscribe, and we'll be back next month with another podcast with Analytics FC. Bye for now.